In the dying light of a March evening in 1895, smoke rose from a cottage in Ballivadley, Ireland, carrying the scent of burning flesh and ancient superstition. The woman they burned was not a witch, though some would later paint her as such. She was Bridget Cleary, and her death would mark the point where medieval folklore collided fatally with the dawn of the modern age. They found her body in a shallow grave, her flesh still bearing the marks of the fire that had consumed her final moments. She had been dressed in her finest clothes, as if for a journey or a funeral. But this was no ordinary burial. The positioning of her corpse, face down with her hands bound, spoke of fear, not of the dead, but of their return. Bridget Cleary's story begins long before the flames that ended it. Born Bridget Boland in Clonmel, County Tipperary, she emerged from childhood with an independence that set her apart from her contemporaries. While other women of 1890s rural Ireland settled into lives of domestic submission, Bridget learned the trade of dressmaking and egg selling, earning her own income, and with it, a measure of freedom that would later be seen as dangerous. Her marriage to Michael Cleary in 1887 seemed, on the surface, a good match. He was a cooper by trade, skilled and respected. Together, they represented the emerging class of rural artisans, literate and relatively prosperous, straddling the divide between the old ways and the new. But beneath this veneer of domestic harmony lay deeper currents. Bridget's independence, once attractive, began to chafe against Michael's traditional expectations. Her childlessness after 8 years of marriage raised whispers in a society where a woman's worth was measured largely by her fertility. The events that led to her death began with a simple illness, bronchitis, according to the doctor who would later testify at the trial. But in the intersection of medical science and folk belief that characterized rural Ireland, physical ailments were rarely seen as purely natural. When Bridget's illness lingered, darker explanations began to take root. The psychological landscape of 1895 Ireland was a peculiar one, where rationality and superstition existed in uneasy partnership. The Great Famine was still within living memory, its shadow lengthening over every aspect of rural life. The fairy faith, far from being mere storytelling, provided a framework for understanding misfortune in a world where official explanations, whether from church or state, often proved inadequate. For Michael Cleary, watching his wife's illness progress, the old stories began to take on new significance. Bridget's increasing pallor, her difficulty in eating, her occasional delirium, all could be explained by the ancient belief in fairy abduction. According to folklore, the fairies would steal away a healthy person, leaving in their place a sickly changeling that only appeared to be the original. The psychological deterioration that followed reveals much about both the power of belief and the nature of domestic violence. Over several days in March, the Cleary cottage became the site of an escalating series of cures that blurred the line between folk medicine and torture. Bridget was forced to drink herbs boiled in milk, was held over the fire, was threatened and cajoled to come back, to prove she wasn't a changeling. Witnesses later described how Michael Cleary's behavior became increasingly erratic. He questioned whether the woman in his house was truly his wife, demanded she recite phrases to prove her identity, and spoke of seeing her run with the fairies at night. What modern observers might recognize as a psychological break manifested itself in the language and logic of folk belief. The participation of family members and neighbors in these events adds another layer of complexity to the tragedy. Bridget's father, Patrick Boland, was present during the final fatal confrontation. Her aunt, Mary Kennedy, helped hold her down. The local priest, Father Ryan, had visited earlier in the week and performed Catholic rites alongside traditional cures. On the night of March 15th, 1895, the escalating tension reached its brutal climax. Michael Cleary, convinced that the woman in his house was a fairy changeling rather than his wife, subjected Bridget to a final ordeal. In front of witnesses, he forced her to wear the dress she had worn at their wedding, a detail heavy with symbolic significance. When she failed to satisfy his demands for proof of her identity, he threw lamp oil over her and set her alight. The testimony at the subsequent trial painted a picture of horror that scandalized Victorian society. Witnesses described how Bridget had screamed that she was not a changeling, but Michael's wife. They recounted how, after her death, Michael had claimed she wasn't dead at all, but had gone off with the fairies, and that he would wait at the fairy fort to see her ride out on a white horse. The case became a sensation that extended far beyond Ireland's shores. British newspapers seized upon it as evidence of Irish backwardness, using the murder to argue against Home Rule. Lost in these broader political narratives was Bridget herself, a woman whose real crime might have been her refusal to conform to the expectations of her time and place. Michael Cleary was ultimately convicted of manslaughter rather than murder, receiving a sentence of 20 years. The lesser charge reflected the jury's acceptance that he had acted under the influence of superstitious belief rather than malice aforethought. This verdict itself speaks volumes about the complex intersection of traditional beliefs and modern justice in late Victorian Ireland. The psychological aspects of the case continue to fascinate scholars. Was Michael Cleary's belief in fairies a genuine expression of folk tradition or a convenient cover for domestic violence? Did Bridget's independence and childlessness make her particularly vulnerable to accusations of being suspicious or even evil? The answers lie somewhere in the shadowy territory between rational explanation and supernatural belief. The broader historical context adds yet another layer to the tragedy. The 1890s marked a period of significant change in rural Ireland. Bridget Cleary, with her sewing machine and independent income, represented this changing world, perhaps too well for her own safety. Bridget's assertiveness, her financial independence, her childlessness, all marked her as different in ways that threatened traditional, predominantly male authority. The accusation of being a changeling in this reading becomes a way of literally dehumanizing a woman who refused to conform. The site of Bridget's death remains marked in the landscape of Ballyvadley. The cottage where she died still stands, though now in ruins. The fairy fort where her body was initially hidden remains untouched, protected by the same superstitions that contributed to her death. The legal documents from the case present a stark contrast to the folkloric elements of the story. Police reports, medical testimony, and court transcripts attempt to impose rational order on events that defied rational explanation. The doctor who treated Bridget testified about bronchitis and nervous excitement, while witnesses spoke of fairy forts and changeling tests. Perhaps the most poignant aspects of the case lie in the small details that emerged during the trial. Bridget's new boots, bought just before her illness, the egg money she had saved, which disappeared after her death, the sewing machine that sat silent in the corner of the cottage while she was being cured. These mundane objects speak to a life cut short, to ambitions never realized. The final testimony at Michael Cleary's trial came from a neighbor who had witnessed Bridget's last moments. She recalled Bridget's final words, "I am Bridget Boland, your wife." It was both a declaration of identity and a plea for recognition, ignored by those who had already decided she was something other than human. Today, the story of Bridget Cleary continues to resonate, finding new meaning in each generation that encounters it. For some, she represents the clash between tradition and modernity. For still others, her story marks the end of an older Ireland, where the boundary between the natural and supernatural worlds was more permeable. In Ballyvadler, they say that on certain nights in March, when the wind carries across the fields where the fairy forts still stand. You can hear the sound of someone working at a sewing machine, the rhythmic clicking of progress against tradition. Of a woman who dared to stitch her own fate until the flames came, to unpick every stitch. Let us know if you enjoyed this video. Also, let us know in the comments what historical figures you'd like us to profile next. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see more videos like these.